The Arctic Research Drilling Station stopped responding on November 3, 2024, at 2:17 a.m. UTC, and when the emergency team arrived 16 hours later, they found 12 people standing motionless on the ice shelf staring at the borehole, their eyes frozen open, their bodies locked in positions that suggested they'd been watching something rise for hours before hypothermia took them. And the drilling equipment designed to penetrate 3.2 kilometers into the permafrost had somehow reversed direction and drilled upward through solid ice that shouldn't exist above the surface, creating a perfect cylindrical shaft extending 847 meters into the sky, where it terminated in a geometric pattern that matched symbols found in Sumerian texts describing the watchers who sleep beneath. I'm Dr. James Reeves, Senior Glaciologist with the International Arctic Research Consortium, and I'm recording this from a hotel in Longyearbyen, Svalbard, because 6 hours ago my security clearance was revoked, my research credentials were suspended, and 2 men with Norwegian military identification confiscated every piece of equipment I owned except the backup drive I'd hidden in a fake battery compartment that contains the final transmission from Station Polaris 7, the transmission that shows what came up through the borehole, the transmission that explains why 12 experienced researchers chose to freeze to death rather than stop watching, the transmission that proves we weren't drilling into the permafrost. We were drilling into something that had been using the permafrost as camouflage for approximately 47,000 years. Station Polaris 7 was established in October 2023 as part of a multinational climate research initiative. The official mission was studying ice core samples to document historical climate patterns, standard glaciology, routine science, teams rotating every 6 months, 12 researchers, state-of-the-art drilling equipment capable of extracting cores from unprecedented depths. Dr. Sarah Volkov led the team, brilliant, methodical, someone I'd worked with for 8 years across 4 continents, someone who followed protocols so religiously she'd abort entire drilling operations over minor procedural deviations, someone who would never, under any circumstances, authorize drilling into anomalous substrates without comprehensive analysis. But on November 2, 2024, at 14:33 UTC, she did exactly that. The drill logs show a sudden change in operational parameters. The bit encountered resistance at 3.1 kilometers depth. Standard procedure requires stopping, extracting the core, analyzing the composition, determining if continuation is safe. The logs show Sarah overrode every safety protocol, pushed the drill through the resistance layer, and what happened next contradicts everything we understand about drilling mechanics, about ice formation, about geological strata. The drill bit punched through the resistance layer and encountered void empty space, at 3.1 kilometers beneath Arctic permafrost, where the pressure should be crushing, where ice should be compressed into forms denser than steel. The drill entered a cavity, a hollow. The bit fell freely for 47 seconds before striking something that wasn't ice, wasn't rock, wasn't any material in our geological database. The seismic sensors registered the impact, measured the vibration, calculated the density of what the drill had struck. The readings were impossible. Negative mass, material that displaced space rather than occupying it, material that shouldn't exist according to known physics. Sarah's voice comes through on the audio logs at 1512utc.com/professional, but underneath the professional tone there's something else: excitement, wonder, the vocal signature of someone seeing something they'd spent their entire career hoping to find. We've encountered an anomaly. Structure at 3.1 kilometers showing properties inconsistent with geological formation. Recommend immediate enhanced scanning. This isn't natural. This is architecture. Architecture. That single word changed everything. Changed the mission. Changed the protocols. Changed what we were allowed to know about what exists beneath the Arctic ice. The enhanced scanning began at 16 o'clock UTC. Ground-penetrating radar seismic imaging. Electromagnetic resonance mapping. Every tool we had for visualizing subsurface structures. The data that came back made the analysis team go silent for 17 minutes. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. They just stared at the displays showing what existed 3 kilometers beneath their feet. I've seen the images, analyzed the data, spent 6 weeks trying to find natural explanations, trying to convince myself this was unusual geology, rare mineral formations, undocumented ice crystal structures, anything except what the data clearly showed. A chamber, roughly circular, approximately 2.3 kilometers in diameter, walls that weren't walls, surfaces that reflected the scanning equipment in ways that suggested they were designed to be reflective, designed to redirect energy, designed to remain hidden from any detection method we might employ. But the most disturbing feature wasn't the chamber itself. It was what occupied the center. The scans showed a mass, solid, dense, organic, approximately 400 meters in height and 180 meters in diameter at its widest point, roughly humanoid. 2 upper appendages, 2 lower appendages, a central trunk, a head-like structure at the apex, but the proportions were wrong. The limbs too long. The joints positioned at angles that suggested additional degrees of freedom, additional dimensions of movement, and it was growing. The sequential scans taken at 30-minute intervals showed expansion, measurable growth, 0.03% increase in volume every hour, like something thawing, something warming, something returning to active state after prolonged dormancy. Dr. Chen from the geology team ran calculations, extrapolated the growth rate backward, determined when this entity would have entered dormancy based on current expansion velocity. The number was 47,000 years, plus or minus 800 years, roughly corresponding to the end of the last glacial maximum, when the ice sheets were at their thickest, when something might have chosen to sleep beneath the Arctic, when something might have decided to wait for the ice to melt. Sarah made the decision at 1845 UTC against protocols, against common sense, against every safety regulation governing deep drilling operations. She ordered the team to reverse the drill, to create an access shaft from the surface to the chamber, to establish direct contact with whatever was down there. The logs show arguments, Dr. Martinez objecting, Dr. Kim questioning the authorization, Dr. Hassan demanding they consult with command before proceeding. Sarah overruled them all, used her authority as station commander to authorize the operation, and the drill began boring upward through 3 kilometers of permafrost, creating a perfect cylindrical passage from the chamber to the surface. It took 6 hours, the drill working in reverse, removing ice, creating void, building a tunnel, a connection, a pathway between what slept below and the world above. The video logs from the drilling platform show the team assembled around the borehole as the drill completed its work at 0:47 UTC on November 3rd. 12 people standing in Arctic darkness with temperatures at -40-3 Celsius, standing without proper cold weather gear, standing mesmerized, watching the borehole, waiting for something. The seismic sensors registered movement at 1:15 UTC, vibration from the chamber, the entity shifting, changing position, beginning to ascend through the shaft the drill had created. The video shows Sarah stepping closer to the borehole, the others following, all 12 researchers forming a circle around the opening, staring down into the darkness. Nobody speaking, nobody showing fear or concern, just watching, just waiting, just witnessing what rose from 3 kilometers beneath the ice. The first visible sign appeared at 1:33 UTC: bioluminescence, blue-white light emanating from the borehole, growing brighter, pulsing, rhythmic, like breathing, like a heartbeat. The light was so intense it created stark shadows across the ice, made the researchers appear as dark silhouettes against the brilliance, and they didn't move, didn't shield their eyes, didn't retreat from the increasing radiance. They stood frozen, literally and figuratively, bodies locked in position, eyes fixed on the light, minds trapped in observation of something that human neurology wasn't designed to process. At 2:17 UTC the entity emerged, not fully, just partially. The appendage that broke the surface was approximately 40 meters long and 12 meters in diameter, covered in what appeared to be scales or plates, but at a size that made each individual segment visible from the video camera. Positioned 200 meters away, the surface wasn't biological, wasn't mechanical, somewhere between organic material structured with geometric precision, living tissue organized according to mathematical principles, and the appendage was reaching, extending, growing upward from the borehole like a massive limb stretching after prolonged sleep. The air temperature dropped 17 degrees in 40 seconds, not from weather, from the entity's presence, like it was absorbing thermal energy, consuming heat from the environment to fuel its awakening. Ice crystals formed instantaneously on every surface, the drilling equipment, the research instruments, the researchers themselves. Frost spreading across their clothing, across their exposed skin, across their eyes. And still they watched, still they stood motionless, still they bore witness as the appendage continued rising until it terminated 847 meters above the ice shelf in a configuration of digits, not fingers, not tentacles, but something else arranged in a pattern that matched symbols I'd seen before in Dr. Volkov's research on ancient Sumerian astronomy. The video ends at 2:19 UTC. Transmission terminated. No final message, no distress call, just silence. The emergency response team arrived at 18:30 UTC, found the station intact, equipment functioning, life support operational, supply sufficient, everything normal except for the 12 researchers standing in a perfect circle around the borehole, frozen solid, dead for approximately 16 hours based on core body temperature. Eyes open, faces showing no pain or fear, just expressions of profound attention, of complete focus, of witnessing something so compelling that death by exposure was preferable to looking away. And extending from the borehole was that appendage, still there, still reaching upward, still terminating in that geometric configuration 847 meters above the ice. Except now it was translucent, semi-corporeal, visible but not entirely present in our dimensional framework, like something that existed partially in our reality and partially in spaces we can't perceive. The recovery team took photographs, measurements, samples, all classified within hours, all removed from standard research databases, all evidence that something impossible had emerged from beneath the Arctic permafrost. I wasn't at Station Polaris 7 when this happened. I was in Tromsk analyzing previous ice cores. Sarah was my colleague, my friend, someone I trusted with my life during a dozen dangerous expeditions, someone whose judgment I'd never questioned. But when I received the classified briefing about the incident, when I saw the video footage and the seismic data and the analysis of what the drill had encountered, I violated protocol, downloaded the files, encrypted them, hid them, because I knew this would be buried. Knew the governments involved would classify everything. Knew humanity would never learn that we'd discovered something beneath the ice that had been sleeping since the Pleistocene. Something that was waking up. Something that had used the permafrost as camouflage for 47 millennia. Something that 12 brilliant researchers died to witness. The classified files I extracted from Station Polaris 7's servers contained something the official reports never mentioned. A second borehole drilled 3 weeks before the main shaft. Smaller, exploratory, positioned exactly 2.3 kilometers southeast of the primary drilling site, and the core sample extracted from that preliminary hole contained biological material that carbon dating placed at 2.1 million years old, not fossilized, not mineralized, preserved, living tissue in a state of suspended animation so profound that cellular decay had effectively stopped. Dr. Hassan's analysis noted the tissue samples showed response to thermal stimulation when warmed to -15 Celsius. The cells began demonstrating electrochemical activity, neurofiring patterns, synaptic transmission, like something waking up after geological epochs of dreamless sleep. Sarah knew, 3 weeks before she ordered the main drilling operation. 3 weeks before 12 people died watching something emerge, he knew what was down there because she'd already touched it, already stimulated it, already sent signals into the ice that something vast and patient had been waiting to receive. The preliminary core sample logs show her handwriting, margin notes, observations that never made it into official reports. Tissue responds to rhythmic thermal pulses. Reaction suggests communication attempt. Recommend enhanced contact protocols. Enhanced contact. She wasn't studying an anomaly. She was trying to talk to it, trying to wake it, trying to establish dialogue with something that had been buried beneath Arctic ice since before Homo sapiens existed. I found her personal research files in the encrypted partition. Years of work, decades of obsession. Sarah hadn't stumbled onto this discovery by accident. She'd been searching for it, following patterns, tracking correlations between ancient sites and geological anomalies. She had files on Göbekli Tepe, Easter Island, Puma Punku megalithic structures built with precision that shouldn't have been possible for their respective time periods, and she'd mapped them, plotted their locations, found the pattern. Every significant ancient site aligned with deep geological structures, chambers, vaults, spaces carved into bedrock at depths that made them invisible to surface archaeology. She believed these weren't just monuments, they were markers, warning signs, memorials built by survivors to mark locations where something was sealed away. The Arctic chamber was just one of 17. Sarah had identified them all. Deep scanning data, seismic anomalies, gravitational irregularities suggesting massive hollow spaces beneath the Earth's crust. 17 locations scattered across the globe, beneath ice sheets, under ocean trenches, deep in continental bedrock, all showing the same characteristics: geometric precision, negative mass signatures, thermal anomalies suggesting something inside generating heat. And according to her calculations, all 17 sites were warming. The entities within were waking up, not because of random geological processes, because we were drilling, because we were mining, because we were penetrating deeper into the Earth's crust than ever before in human history, because we were accidentally breaching seals that had held for epochs. Her timeline was terrifying. The first anomaly was detected in 1972, the Soviet deep drilling project in the Kola Peninsula. They reached 12,262 meters, deepest hole ever drilled. Official reports say they stopped because of high temperatures and technical difficulties. Sarah's files contain leaked audio, screams, not human, coming from the borehole, coming from something that had been disturbed. The Soviets sealed the hole immediately, poured concrete, abandoned the site, never explained why. Sarah believed they'd touched something, triggered something, set in motion a process that took decades to manifest but was irreversible once started. She tracked every deep drilling project after Kola Deepwater Horizon in 2010. Officially an oil platform disaster caused by mechanical failure. Sarah's analysis showed seismic activity originating from the well itself in the hours before the explosion. Not tectonic, not pressure-related movement. Something in the borehole responding to the intrusion. Something reaching upward. The platform didn't explode because of mechanical failure. It exploded because something came up through the drill shaft and the methane ignition was a secondary consequence of its emergence. 11 workers died. The well was capped. The investigation focused on corporate negligence. Nobody looked at the seismic data. Nobody asked why ocean temperatures around the platform dropped 18 degrees in the hour before the disaster. Nobody wondered why the final video footage from the rig showed workers standing motionless on the platform staring at the drill column while fire spread around them. Station Polaris 7 was the 17th incident. Sarah had documented 16 previous encounters. 16 times humans had drilled too deep or mined too aggressively and touched something that responded. 16 times people had died or disappeared or gone silent. 16 times evidence had been classified or destroyed or explained away as natural disasters or equipment failures or human error. But the pattern was clear. We were waking them up, all 17 entities, simultaneously because they were connected. Sarah's research suggested a network, a communication system linking all 17 chambers. When one entity was disturbed, the others knew. When one began warming, the others responded. Coordinated awakening, synchronized emergence, like they'd been waiting for this, planning for this, expecting that eventually human civilization would advance enough to start digging deep enough to find them. The entity beneath Polaris 7 wasn't fully emerged. The appendage extending 847 meters above the ice was reconnaissance testing, sensing that thermal absorption wasn't random energy consumption, it was mapping, learning, understanding what kind of world existed on the surface, what kind of atmosphere, what kind of temperature range, what kind of life forms. The translucent quality wasn't partial materialization. It was dimensional scanning. The entity existed in more than 3 spatial dimensions and was projecting itself into our perceptual framework, observing us the way we might observe flatland creatures, from a vantage point that allows total comprehension while remaining mostly incomprehensible to the observed. I found communication logs Sarah had buried in encrypted files. She'd been in contact with other researchers. Dr. Yuki Tanaka in Japan studying the Mariana Trench anomaly. Dr. James Morrison in Scotland investigating seismic signatures beneath the North Sea. Dr. Ana Santos in Brazil analyzing gravitational data from the Amazon basin. All of them had found chambers. All of them had detected warming. All of them had died or disappeared within 6 months of their discoveries. Tanaka's submersible was lost with all hands in July 2023. Morrison died in a car accident in September 2023. Santos vanished from her hotel room in January 2024. Sarah knew she was next. Knew that discovering these entities came with consequences. But she continued anyway. Continued drilling. Continued trying to make contact, because she believed communication was possible, believed understanding was achievable, believed that whatever slept in these chambers had been waiting for intelligent life on the surface to evolve enough to comprehend them. Her final research note was dated November 1, 2024, 2 days before the emergence. The entity responds to prime number sequences. Thermal pulses arranged in Fibonacci patterns trigger bioluminescent responses. This is language. This is conversation. It knows we're here. It's been waiting for us to find it. Tomorrow we complete the main borehole. Tomorrow we establish direct contact. Tomorrow we learn what has been sleeping beneath our feet for millions of years. She knew the risks, knew the drilling would be dangerous, knew the thermal changes could be catastrophic. But she proceeded because she believed the potential discovery justified the danger. Believed that making contact with something that predated human civilization was worth dying for. The emergency response team's classified report contained details that never reached public knowledge. The 12 frozen researchers weren't just dead, they were changed. Autopsies showed neurological modifications, new neural pathways, synaptic connections that hadn't existed before. Their brains had been restructured, rewritten, modified in the hours they spent watching the entity emerge, modified by exposure to something that existed in dimensional frameworks our neurology wasn't designed to process. They hadn't frozen because they couldn't move. They froze because they chose not to move, because whatever they were witnessing was so profound, so overwhelming, so fundamentally important that preserving the observation was more valuable than preserving their lives. And the entity was still there. Still extending that appendage into the Arctic sky. The Norwegian government established a quarantine zone, 50-kilometer radius, no flea designation, military enforcement. Official explanation cited environmental contamination from drilling chemicals. But I accessed the satellite imagery. Watched the daily updates. The appendage was growing, 0.047 meters per day, steady, consistent, reaching higher, and at night, when Arctic darkness was complete, it glowed. That same blue-white bioluminescence, pulsing in patterns, rhythmic, mathematical broadcasting, not randomly, deliberately, sending signals, and every 24 hours at exactly 2:17 UTC, the other 16 sites responded. Seismic sensors detected synchronous activity, thermal blooms, electromagnetic pulses, all 17 entities communicating, all 17 awakening in coordination, all 17 preparing for something. I plotted the growth rates, extrapolated the timeline. At current emergence velocity, the Polaris 7 entity would fully breach the surface in approximately 847 days, 2 years and 4 months, and based on the seismic data from the other 16 sites, they were following the same schedule, all 17 entities emerging simultaneously, all 17 reaching the surface at the same time, coordinated, planned, expected. Sarah had calculated this timeline 6 months before her death, had known exactly when this would happen. Had tried to establish communication before emergence because she believed that was humanity's only chance, believed that if we could talk to them before they fully woke, we might influence what happened next, might negotiate, might understand their purpose, might survive what was coming. But we killed her, not intentionally, not directly, but by classifying her research, by shutting down her investigation, by forcing her to work alone without institutional support or proper resources, By making her choose between abandoning her life's work or proceeding with inadequate safety protocols, she chose to proceed, chose to drill, chose to make contact on her own terms, even if it meant dying in the attempt, and she succeeded. She woke it up, established contact, sent a signal that something 400 meters tall and 47,000 years old, received and understood and responded to. She proved these entities were conscious, were aware, were intelligent, and were waiting for us. The backup drive I'm carrying contains everything. Sarah's research, the classified reports, the satellite imagery, the seismic data from all 17 sites, the autopsy results showing neurological modification, the communication logs proving she wasn't working alone, the evidence that this isn't isolated, isn't unique, isn't containable, because there are 17 of them. 17 massive entities buried in geological strata around the world, 17 things that have been sleeping since before the last ice age, 17 watchers that are waking up simultaneously, and in 847 days they'll all be here, all be present, all be emerged, and nobody knows what happens then because nothing in human history prepares us for this. Nothing in our experience accounts for entities that measure their dormancy in epochs and their awakening in millennia. Nothing explains why they're here, why they were buried, why they're waking now. Sarah thought she had time, thought she could establish communication protocols before full emergence, thought she could prepare humanity for first contact with something genuinely alien, something that predated us, something that might have witnessed our evolution, something that had been waiting beneath the ice and stone and ocean for us to become intelligent enough to find them. She was wrong about the timeline. The emergence is happening faster than her models predicted, but she was right about everything else. They are conscious, they are communicating, they are coordinated, and they know we're here. No, we found them. No, we're watching them emerge. And they're watching back with perspectives that span millions of years in dimensional frameworks we can barely conceptualize. The men who confiscated my equipment work for some organization that knows about the 17 sites, that's been monitoring them, that's been suppressing research and eliminating scientists who get too close to the truth. They have resources, authority, reach across international borders. They killed Tanaka and Morrison and Santos. They would have killed Sarah if she hadn't frozen first. And they're watching me now because I have her research, have her evidence, have proof that something is emerging and nobody is prepared, and the timeline is 847 days and counting. I'm uploading these files everywhere, encrypting them, distributing them, hiding them where they can't all be deleted simultaneously, because someone needs to know, someone needs to understand, someone needs to be ready when the entities fully emerge and we discover what 47,000 years of dormancy was protecting us from, or protecting them from, or protecting something else from. Sarah died believing they were peaceful, believing contact was desirable, believing we could coexist. I hope she was right, but 847 days isn't enough time to prepare for the alternative. I found the communication network 3 days after my credentials were revoked, not through official channels, not through academic databases, through something Sarah had hidden in plain sight, a research paper she published in 2019 about Arctic permafrost methane release patterns, standard climate science peer-reviewed, unremarkable except the data tables contained anomalies, numbers that didn't correlate with the stated methodology, coordinates that placed monitoring stations in locations that don't appear on any geological survey. I ran the coordinates through satellite imaging, found structures, small, isolated, built-in remote locations across 17 countries, and every single one was positioned directly above the chambers Sarah had identified, directly above the sleeping entities. They weren't monitoring stations, they were listening posts. Someone had been tracking these things for decades, someone with resources spanning continents and budgets that suggested governmental or super-governmental organization, someone who knew what was buried and had been waiting for them to wake. The structures followed identical specifications. Reinforced concrete bunkers, 12 meters square, 3 stories deep, seismic monitoring equipment, thermal sensors, electromagnetic field detectors, communication arrays powerful enough to transmit globally, and every facility showed the same construction timeline, built between 1974 and 1979, all completed within a 5-year window, all operational before the 1980s. Whoever built this network knew about the entities 40 years ago, knew where they were buried, knew they would eventually wake, and had been monitoring them systematically since before I was born. The Polaris 7 incident wasn't a surprise to them. It was expected, documented, part of a timeline they'd been tracking since the Cold War. I hacked into one of the facilities, the Svalbard installation, closest to Polaris 7, abandoned after the emergence, equipment still operational, data still transmitting, security protocols outdated enough that modern penetration techniques worked. The archived files went back to 1976, daily reports, seismic readings, thermal measurements, 48 years of continuous monitoring showing gradual changes, temperature increases of 0.003 degrees annually, seismic activity occurring in 23-year cycles, electromagnetic pulses every 847 days, patterns so subtle they'd be invisible without decades of data. But the pattern was there, clear, undeniable. The entities weren't dormant, they were sleeping. And sleep has rhythms, cycles, stages. The monitoring stations had been documenting their REM cycles for half a century. The files contained personnel records, scientists, military liaisons, administrative staff, rotating assignments. Nobody stayed longer than 18 months. Standard operational security, preventing anyone from seeing the full timeline, preventing anyone from understanding the scope, but there were exceptions. Senior researchers who'd been involved since the beginning. Dr. Heinrich Volkov, Dr. Margaret Chen, Dr. Dmitry Petrov, names that appeared repeatedly across multiple facilities, names that showed continuous involvement from 1974 through 2019. And one name that made my hands shake when I saw it, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, Sarah's contact, the researcher studying the Mariana Trench anomaly, listed as terminated in July 2023. Not deceased, terminated like an employment status. Like she'd been removed from the program rather than killed in a submersible accident. The cross-reference showed all three of Sarah's contacts, Tanaka, Morrison, Santos, all former personnel at monitoring facilities. All had spent years tracking the entities. All had left the program between 2019 and 2022. All had continued researching independently. And all had died or disappeared within months of Sarah initiating contact with them. They weren't random researchers who happened to discover the chambers. They were insiders who'd defected, who'd taken classified data, who'd tried to warn the scientific community, who'd reached out to Sarah because she was asking the right questions, because she'd found the pattern independently, because they needed someone outside the network to expose what was happening before the emergence timeline reached completion. The monitoring data showed synchronization, all 17 entities warming simultaneously, all showing increased electromagnetic activity, all demonstrating seismic signatures suggesting movement within their chambers, and the timeline matched Sarah's calculations exactly. First detectable warming in 1972, corresponding to the Kola drilling incident. Acceleration in 2010 after Deepwater Horizon. Exponential increase after 2020. The entities weren't responding to individual drilling operations. They were responding to accumulated disturbance, to the total amount of penetration into Earth's crust, to humanity's collective digging reaching a threshold that triggered their awakening protocol. We'd drilled enough holes, mined enough resources, fractured enough bedrock, sent enough vibrations through geological strata, and something deep in the Earth had noticed, had interpreted the disturbance as a signal, had begun the process of waking up. I found the origin document buried in encrypted archives requiring 3 separate decryption keys. A report dated November 1947, authored by someone whose name had been redacted, submitted to an organization identified only as the Council in Sarah's translation notes. The report described geological anomalies discovered during post-war reconstruction drilling in Germany, unexpected voids at extreme depth, thermal signatures suggesting heat sources that couldn't be explained by geothermal activity, and recommendations immediate cessation of deep drilling, comprehensive global survey to identify all similar anomalies, establishment of permanent monitoring network, strict information control to prevent public awareness. The report was marked approved and dated November 14, 1947. The monitoring network wasn't built in response to the 1972 Kola incident. It was built in response to something discovered in 1947, something that convinced governments devastated by World War II cooperate, to pool resources, to build a secret monitoring system that would operate for decades, to prepare for something they believed was inevitable. The 1947 report included depth calculations. The German anomaly was 8.4 kilometers beneath the surface, too deep for 1947 technology to reach, too deep to investigate directly, but the report contained projections, estimates of when drilling technology would advance enough to breach that depth, when mining operations would penetrate far enough to disturb what was below, when accumulated seismic activity from human industry would trigger response. The timeline they calculated was 75 years, plus or minus 5 years. Somewhere between 2017 and 2027, human activity would reach the threshold that would wake the entities. We're in year 7 of that window, and all 17 sites are active. I found communication logs from 2019, encrypted transmissions between monitoring facilities, discussing emergence protocols and containment strategies and population management scenarios. They knew this was coming, knew the entities would wake, knew they would emerge, and they'd been planning responses, evacuation procedures for areas surrounding the 17 sites, media control strategies to explain geological anomalies, military deployment options if containment became necessary. They had 50-kilometer exclusion zones mapped around every location, population displacement estimates ranging from 400,000 to 3.2 million depending on the site, propaganda frameworks ready to implement, everything planned, everything prepared, everything except the most important question: what do we do when they're fully emerged? Because the documents didn't contain that answer, didn't specify what happens after emergence, didn't outline negotiation protocols or communication strategies or defensive measures. The timeline ended at emergence, like the planners couldn't imagine beyond that point, like they understood that once these entities were awake and active, human planning became irrelevant. We'd be responding to their agenda, their timeline, their purposes, whatever those might be. The monitoring network existed to track the awakening, to document the process, to give humanity warning, but not solutions, not strategies, not hope. I accessed satellite thermal imaging for all 17 sites, current data, real-time monitoring. Every location showed temperature elevation. The Arctic site at Polaris 7 was most advanced. Surface temperature around the borehole averaged -8°C despite ambient conditions of -40. The entity was radiating heat, warming the environment, creating a microclimate, and the same pattern appeared at every other site. Thermal blooms, growing circles of elevated temperature, ranging from 2 degrees above ambient at the least active site to 17 degrees at the most advanced. They were terraforming, changing local atmospheric conditions, preparing the surface environment for something, modifying temperature and possibly atmospheric composition to match whatever conditions they required, or whatever conditions they remembered from 47,000 years ago when they were last active. The seismic data was more disturbing. Movement within the chambers, not random, coordinated, all 17 entities shifting position at synchronized intervals, every 847 hours, exact precision across all sites despite being separated by thousands of kilometers. They weren't just aware of each other, they were coordinating, operating on a shared schedule, following a protocol, and the movements were getting larger, more pronounced. The entities were stretching, testing, preparing for full mobility after epochs of stillness. The Polaris 7 appendage, extending 847 meters, wasn't exploration, it was exercise. Physical therapy after geological timescales of immobility, and based on the seismic signatures from the other chambers, similar appendages would emerge at all 16 remaining sites within the next 90 days. I found video footage from the monitoring stations, classified recordings never meant for external access, showing the facilities during operation, personnel conducting routine monitoring, scientists analyzing data, military observers maintaining security, normal scientific operations, until November 3, 2024, when Polaris 7 emerged. The footage from that day showed something else. Personnel abandoning their posts, scientists running from monitoring equipment, military personnel evacuating in panic, not because of structural failure or equipment malfunction, because of the signal. The emergence triggered a broadcast, electromagnetic pulse so powerful it overwhelmed every sensor, audio so loud it shattered speakers, and underneath the noise, something else, pattern, structure, information. The entities weren't just emerging, they were announcing, broadcasting, sending a message that every monitoring facility received simultaneously, a message that made experienced personnel flee their posts despite decades of training and preparation. The audio files were corrupted, damaged by the signal's intensity, but I reconstructed fragments, ran them through analysis software, found structure in the noise, mathematical patterns, prime numbers, Fibonacci sequences, geometric progressions. This wasn't random electromagnetic discharge, this was language, complex, sophisticated, operating on principles that human communication theory recognized but couldn't fully interpret. The entities were speaking, not to us, to each other, coordinating, confirming, synchronizing, all 17 awakening together, all 17 preparing together, all 17 about to emerge together into a world that had changed completely since they last walked its surface. I cross-referenced the geological data with paleoclimate records, found the last time these entities were active, 47,000 years ago, mid-Pleistocene, during the last major glacial period. Global temperatures 8 degrees lower than current baseline, ice sheets covering most of northern hemisphere, sea levels 120 meters below present, megafauna still dominant, Homo sapiens just beginning to spread beyond Africa. That's the world they knew, that's the environment they remembered, that's what they expected to find when they woke up. Instead, they're emerging into the Anthropocene industrial civilization. 7 billion humans, climate change, atmospheric composition altered by 2 centuries of carbon emissions, nuclear weapons, satellite networks, artificial intelligence. Everything changed, everything different, everything strange. And they're waking into it knowing something disturbed them, knowing something broke their sleep, knowing something penetrated deep enough to trigger their emergence protocol. Sarah believed they were curious, believed they wanted to understand what had happened during their dormancy, believed communication was possible, but her research also showed the alternative. Showed what happens when you wake something that's been sleeping for epochs, when you disturb rest that deep, when you force consciousness that operates on geological timescales to adjust to rapid change. Her notes referenced psychological studies on forced awakening, how disorientation leads to aggression, how confusion triggers defensive responses, how beings operating on slow timescales perceive rapid change as threat. We didn't wake them gently. We didn't prepare them, we drilled, we mined, we fractured, we sent shockwaves through their chambers, we forced them awake, and now they're emerging into a world they don't recognize, emerging confused, emerging disoriented, emerging 400 meters tall with capabilities we can't comprehend and perspectives that span millions of years. And we have 754 days until they're fully here. 754 days to decide whether Sarah was right about their curiosity, or right to be terrified of what forced awakening might trigger. The 17th monitoring station went offline at 2:17 UTC on March 19, 2025. exactly 136 days after Polaris 7's emergence, and when I accessed the final transmission using Sarah's backdoor credentials, I found 73 seconds of footage showing Dr. Heinrich Volkov, the senior researcher who'd been monitoring these entities since 1974, standing alone in the facility's observation room, staring at 17 synchronized seismic displays while speaking directly into the camera with the calm resignation of someone who'd spent 50 years preparing for this exact moment. They're not waking up. They never went to sleep. We've been measuring their dream state for half a century and mistaking dormancy for unconsciousness, but the entities have been aware the entire time, processing information at geological speeds, experiencing 47,000 years as we experience a single night's rest. And the emergence we've been tracking isn't awakening, it's them deciding we've finally become interesting enough to acknowledge. I found Volkov's personal research archive in the station's secure partition, 51 years of observations, daily notes, hypotheses that evolved across decades, and a timeline that proved Sarah had been wrong about everything except the most important part. The entities weren't buried by accident, weren't sealed away by some ancient catastrophe. They'd positioned themselves deliberately, chosen locations with specific geological properties, chosen depths that would place them below the threshold of early human detection, chosen thermal environments that would preserve them indefinitely while allowing continuous sensory input through the bedrock itself. They'd been listening for 47,000 years, listening to everything happening on the surface, every seismic event, every volcanic eruption, every earthquake, and after humans appeared, every footstep, every structure we built, every technology we developed. All of it transmitted through vibrations in the Earth's crust that they perceived as clearly as we perceive sound. Volkov's analysis showed the pattern. The entities positioned themselves in 1974 because that's when human seismic activity reached sufficient intensity for them to distinguish individual events, nuclear tests, deep mining, reservoir-induced seismicity from massive dam construction. We became loud enough for them to hear us as distinct from natural geological processes, and they started responding. Subtle shifts in position every 23 years. Minor thermal fluctuations every 847 days, electromagnetic pulses that monitoring equipment interpreted as geological phenomena but that Volkov recognized as deliberate signals. Communication attempts, not directed at us, directed at each other. 17 entities spread across the globe, coordinating through the Earth itself, using the planet as their communication medium, sending messages through seismic waves that took hours or days to propagate but that carried information with perfect fidelity across any distance. The dream hypothesis explained everything. Consciousness doesn't stop during sleep. It shifts, changes state, processes differently. Dreams compress time, allow the mind to experience hours of subjective experience in minutes of objective time. Entities operating on geological timescales might experience 47,000 years of dormancy as we experience a single night. And during that night, they'd been dreaming, processing, planning, waiting for the right moment to shift from dream state to active awareness. That moment was now. Not because we'd drilled deep enough to physically disturb them, because we'd become sophisticated enough to be worth engaging with, because we've developed technology, language, science, civilization, everything they'd been waiting for us to achieve, everything they'd been monitoring our progress toward for millennia. I found the translation protocols in Volkov's files. He'd spent 30 years decoding the electromagnetic patterns, treating them as language, mapping syntax, identifying grammar, building a lexicon from repeated signals, and he'd succeeded. The November 3rd broadcast that emptied the monitoring stations wasn't incomprehensible noise. It was a message, clear, precise, directed at humanity. Volkov had decoded it, had understood what the entities were saying, and had immediately ordered evacuation because he knew what was coming. The message wasn't a greeting. It was an invitation. We acknowledge your presence. We recognize your development. We initiate contact protocols. Prepare for integration assessment. Timeline: 847 solar cycles from emergence announcement. Compliance is expected. Resistance will be documented. Integration assessment. Volkov's notes explored every possible interpretation. Integration into what? Assessment of what criteria? The entities weren't invading, weren't threatening, weren't demanding. They were evaluating, testing, determining whether humanity met some standard, some requirement, some threshold of development that qualified us for whatever came next. And we had 847 days from November 3rd, 2024, to prepare. 847 days to figure out what they wanted, what they expected, what integration meant when proposed by beings that measure time in epochs and exists partially outside our dimensional framework. The satellite imagery showed acceleration, all 17 appendages now visible above their respective sites, growing, extending, reaching higher into the atmosphere. The Arctic appendage had reached 2,300 meters, nearly twice its original height, and the others were catching up. Synchronized growth rates suggesting coordinated development toward some target configuration, some final form, some structure they were building together across 17 locations simultaneously. Volkov's projections showed the endpoint. If current growth continued, the appendages would reach 12,000 meters within 600 days, extending into the stratosphere, creating physical structures that would be visible from orbit. monuments, towers, antennas. Whatever these entities were building, it was designed to be planetary scale, designed to be impossible to ignore, designed to force humanity to acknowledge that we shared this world with something else. I accessed military satellite feeds through backdoor credentials Sarah had obtained from Morrison before his death, found thermal imaging of all 17 sites, found something the civilian monitoring hadn't detected. The entities were creating zones, circles of altered environment expanding from each emergence point, not just temperature, everything, atmospheric composition, electromagnetic fields, gravitational measurements, showing 0.007% decrease within the affected radius. The zones were growing, 3 meters diameter expansion daily, perfect circles, perfect synchronization. At current rates, the zones would overlap in 380 days, would create a connected network spanning the globe, would transform Earth's entire surface into whatever environment the entities required, or remembered, or considered optimal. I found the Council. Volkov's files referenced them repeatedly. Not a government, not an organization. Something older. The 1947 report had been submitted to them. The monitoring network answered to them. The information suppression served their agenda. Volkov's notes suggested they'd existed since at least the 18th century, possibly longer. A group that transcended national boundaries, that operated across generations, that maintained institutional knowledge about things governments preferred to forget. Things like entities sleeping beneath the earth. Things like ancient warnings carved into stone. Things like the question of whether humanity was alone. They'd been preparing for emergence since before Volkov was born, since before his parents were born. Preparing because they had historical knowledge, documents, evidence that this had happened before. The historical analysis was buried in encrypted archives requiring quantum decryption that I could only access through computing time I stole from university servers. It showed a pattern, civilizational collapse, recurring through human history, not gradual decline. Sudden, comprehensive, advanced societies that disappeared within decades left massive monuments, then vanished. The Bronze Age collapse. The Mayan abandonment. Angkor Wat, Easter Island. Civilizations that reached peaks of architectural and organizational sophistication then ceased existing almost overnight. And at every site, geological evidence of seismic activity, of unusual thermal signatures, of electromagnetic anomalies, of something emerging briefly then retreating. The entities had been doing this for millennia, emerging, assessing, integrating or rejecting, then returning to dormancy, waiting for the next cycle, the next civilization, the next opportunity to evaluate whether humanity had developed enough. We'd failed every previous test. Every advanced civilization that the entities had assessed had been found wanting, had been rejected, had collapsed in the aftermath of contact. Not destroyed, not conquered, just abandoned, left without the knowledge or resources or organizational capacity they'd achieved at their peaks. The monuments remained, the stone structures, the architectural achievements, but the people reverted, lost writing, lost mathematics, lost whatever they'd learned during their brief flowering. The entities took something, or removed something, or altered something that made continuation impossible. And humanity started over, built again, climbed toward civilization again, prepared for the next assessment, the next test, the next opportunity to prove we'd evolved enough. This was our turn. Our assessment, our chance to demonstrate that Homo sapiens in the 21st century had developed beyond what Homo sapiens in 1200 BCE or 800 CE or any previous iteration had achieved. And we had 847 days to figure out what the criteria were, what the entities wanted to see, what would result in integration versus rejection. Volkov had theories. Intelligence wasn't the measure. Previous civilizations had been intelligent, had built wonders, had created art and mathematics and philosophy. They'd failed anyway. Technology wasn't the criteria. We weren't being assessed on our tools or our weapons or our machines. We were being assessed on something else, something Volkov believed was fundamental, something he'd spent 30 years trying to understand before he evacuated that monitoring station and disappeared. I found his final message, recorded hours before the station went dark, addressed to no one, or to everyone, or to whoever eventually accessed these files and tried to understand what was coming. The entities aren't testing our intelligence or technology. They're testing our awareness, our capacity to recognize that we're not alone, that we never were, that the universe is crowded with consciousness operating at scales we barely comprehend. Every previous civilization failed because they couldn't make that conceptual leap, couldn't accept that they weren't the pinnacle of existence, couldn't integrate into a larger framework because they couldn't imagine that framework existed. But we're different. We have science, we have astronomy, we have quantum mechanics and relativity and theories that prepare us for incomprehensible scales. We can imagine billion-year timescales and galaxy-spanning distances and dimensions beyond our perception. We can conceive of the entities, can understand what they are even if we can't fully comprehend them. And that capacity for conceptual flexibility might be exactly what they're testing. Whether we can accept being small, being young, being one consciousness among many. Whether we can integrate into something larger without losing what makes us human. The appendages weren't just structures, weren't just monuments or antennas or territorial markers. They were interfaces, connection points, dimensional bridges being constructed to facilitate whatever integration meant. Volkov believed the entities existed primarily in higher dimensions, that their physical manifestation in our three-dimensional space was analogous to us dipping a finger into water. Most of their being remained elsewhere, in frameworks we couldn't access, in spaces our neurology wasn't designed to perceive. The appendages were extending into those spaces while simultaneously reaching into ours, creating pathways, building infrastructure for communication or travel or merging, building the physical architecture that would allow whatever came next. I mapped the 17 locations onto geological surveys, found they weren't random, weren't selected based on depth or thermal properties or seismic characteristics. They were positioned on ley lines, energy meridians, whatever you wanted to call the mathematical patterns that connected ancient sacred sites. The entities had positioned themselves at nodes, at intersection points where multiple lines converged, where Earth's natural energy flows, magnetic fields, gravitational variations, thermal currents created concentrations. They'd chosen these locations because the planet's own structure would amplify their signals, would enhance their communication, would allow them to affect larger areas with less energy expenditure. They'd been strategic, careful, intelligent in ways that suggested they'd done this before, on other worlds, in other systems. This was procedure, protocol, standard assessment methodology refined across geological epochs of practice. The timeline was accelerating, growth rates increasing, thermal zones expanding faster, electromagnetic broadcasts intensifying. Something was approaching, some threshold, some completion point. I calculated convergence, extrapolated curves, found the date when all 17 appendages would reach target height, when all 17 zones would overlap, when all 17 entities would complete whatever construction they were coordinating. April 19, 2026, exactly 847 days after initial emergence, exactly as the message had specified, exactly as they'd planned, and humanity was unprepared. Governments were still pretending the sites were geological anomalies, still maintaining exclusion zones while offering no explanations, still suppressing information while having no plans, still operating as if this was controllable, manageable, survivable through standard crisis protocols. But Volkov knew better. The Council knew better. Sarah had known better. This wasn't survivable through evacuation or military response or diplomatic negotiation. This was existential, species level. The entities weren't here to coexist. They were here to assess and integrate or reject. And integration meant change, fundamental restructuring, accepting our place in a hierarchy we hadn't known existed, becoming part of something larger than human civilization, something that operated on scales that made nations and cultures and individual identities seem as temporary as weather patterns. Sarah had died trying to communicate, trying to establish dialogue before the assessment began, trying to influence the criteria, trying to show them that humanity was ready, was willing, was capable of the conceptual leap required. I'm uploading everything: Volkov's research, the decoded message, the historical analysis, the timeline, the projection for April 19, 2026. All of it encrypted and distributed across networks that can't be completely erased. Because in 711 days the entities complete their emergence, complete their construction, complete their assessment, and humanity needs to know what's being tested, needs to understand that this isn't first contact in the way we imagined. This is evaluation. This is judgment. This is the moment when we discover whether our species qualifies for whatever comes after, whether we can accept being integrated into frameworks we don't control, whether we can survive the conceptual death of human supremacy, whether we can look at something 400 meters tall that's been sleeping beneath our feet for 47,000 years and recognize it not as threat but as teacher, as superior, as the thing we need to learn from if we want to continue existing. I'm Dr. James Reeves, former glaciologist, current witness to the largest event in human history, recording from locations that change daily because the Council doesn't want this information public, doesn't want panic, doesn't want humanity trying to resist or fight or flee. They believe acceptance is our only option, that the entities have already decided that April 19, 2026 will reveal what 47,000 years of observation has concluded about our worthiness. I don't know if they're right, don't know if resistance is futile, don't know if acceptance is wisdom or surrender. All I know is Sarah died believing we could communicate, Volkov disappeared believing we could understand, and 17 entities are building something that will change everything in 711 days. The appendages are still growing, the zones are still expanding, the timeline is still counting down, and somewhere beneath the Arctic ice and the ocean trenches and the continental bedrock, 17 massive presences are awakening fully, preparing for surface existence, preparing to assess what we've become during their long dreaming, preparing to decide whether humanity integrates or reverts, whether we continue forward or start over, whether we're ready for what comes next. April 19, 2020, 6.711 days. The entities emerge completely. The assessment concludes, and we discover what sleeping gods think of the children who woke them.